Brilliant. Okay. Cool. So, hi everyone, and welcome to the MDU Advanced Training bonus session. Thanks a lot all for coming. I see that there's over 50 people now, so that's a really great attendance. Thanks a lot for joining us. So, if I can just get the next slide. So, please. Yeah. So as you know, then we are doing a bonus session that's going to be about politics, but I think more importantly, this is a fundraiser session. So as we already clarified, you don't need to donate because you understand not everyone can afford to donate, but we do have a fundraiser that's currently going on. You can find that on that link or on the Facebook event. The link is in the description. So if you have any means, please go to that link, chip in something, even if it's a small amount. I think it all adds up. So far, the latest I've looked, it might be more now, we've collected over, now it's about almost £6,000, which is insane. So thanks to everyone who already contributed. It's really generous, and we were really shocked and humbled by how generous people were. So yeah, please donate as this is going on. The proceedings are going to go into the 3 charities that you can see at the top. So we're going to be donating to people in need, which is providing sort of immediate humanitarian support, then to Direct Relief, which is a charity that provides mainly medical supplies, but even more than Kiev Independent, which is a sort of paper, journalist paper that's providing a independent and very high quality news from Ukraine. So yeah, so all very deserving charities that the money will go to. So yeah, thanks a lot for that in advance. If I can get next slide. Yeah, so just before we start, I just wanted to say a couple of thank yous because there were a lot of people who helped us or are helping us. So obviously, apart from all the people who are doing the training, we had Jess, Lovro, Lucia, Rock, Rudy, and Dasso coming to judge. Rob can't make it anymore because of a plane, but he was very willing to, so thanks a lot to him as well. Also, a lot of thanks to Ari, who helped us with sort of charities recommendation. He's given us a lot of extensive advice, so that's very appreciated as well. I think Ari's actually here and he's gonna be able to tell you something in a tiny bit. And then thanks a lot to everyone else. There was a long list of people who helped us with promotion and with feedback of the session. So if that was you, yeah, thanks a lot. We really appreciate it. So before I think we go on the content proper, I think that I saw Ari here. So I think he wanted to say a couple words. So I will just hand it over to him for a bit and then we can go back to content.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I will not take a lot of your time. I just wanted to say a huge thank you for everyone involved in making this happen. I think it is an amazing situation going on with all the funds raised and all the people invested in making this happen. I didn't really plan this speech, so this is basically just me being incredibly thankful for people invested in helping us and continuing doing so. One thing that I would just say is please don't stop. While every kind of this event and every step that you're making to help us actually brings a lot of impact. As of right now, we need more and more of it every day. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be like a de-escalation of what's happening, and the war is not over yet. In fact, there is multiple possibilities for it to become even worse. And in that regard, personally from me, I would like to just urge everyone to continue supporting us, starting from being properly informed with what's going on, and supporting and spreading truthful information among your communities, pushing your politicians to an even stronger response and stronger support for Ukraine. And within the debating community as well, I hope that Ukrainians will be able to be properly involved soon and be back here. But we will need your support in different ways for us to be able to do it, in general. So in case you need any kind of information, additionally, any kind of additional sources where you would like to donate or just spread the information, or you want to know or to find sources of information to just read up more about what's happening, please don't hesitate and contact me. I will do my best to respond as soon as possible and give you any kind of useful information that I can, either for direct help or any or resources and media and stuff like that. And with that, I will probably just say again an immense thank you for this initiative to everyone involved and putting your active effort in doing this, and everyone who actually supported it and joined for this session to help us, besides just becoming a better debater. With that, I guess that would be all. So thanks again, and I hope you will have a great session today.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming over. We were all very glad to see you, so thanks a lot for the kind words. So with that then, I think if I can get the next slide. We will have basically 4 sections of this workshop, so you can have a read of what approximately you will be able to hear. Gonna hear from each of us at some point. After this workshop, we are going to have a SPAR debate. A lot of you have already signed up. At this point, when I'm looking at it, I think that we have 2 team spots to have full 6 rooms. So if there's someone who has not signed up but realized that they would want to speak or would want to help us by speaking, because that would save us some stress. If you want to sign up on that same link, first come, first serve, we should be able to get you the spot. So there should be 2 spots unless someone dropped out last second, which I'll probably find out in a sec when I have a look. Okay, so with that, the first one to speak is going to be Hadar. So I'm just going to hand it over to Hadar and we can go on to the content.
Thank you. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. Few general things on what we're going to talk about very quickly. I'm going to run through 3 main key principles that I think are useful to use in many debates about democracy and politics. I am not a philosopher. I am a sad law student. So this is mostly useful for debate purposes. What I'm going to do is with each principle, explain it briefly, then butcher it to the ground and explain why it is stupid in ways that can help you from the opposing side also refute it, and then give some potential rebuttals to the rebuttals to try and strengthen it. Starting with the state power principle, which I think might be the most common one or likeliest to be useful. And the way it goes, and this is kind of an analysis or a state of mind before analysis that will help you in many kinds of these principles. We start by thinking, what is the principle on the individual level that we are deriving from, and then extending it to the state. And in this one, the state power principle talks about autonomy. So it goes with the following. The state has a monopoly on violence. Everything it does either through force or through threat of force, from taxation, enforcing its legislations, etc. All of it is either by putting you in jail or forcing you via the police, or threatening you that if you don't abide by the law, you will be put in jail eventually. Therefore, it inherently infringes on individual autonomy. It forces me to do something, and it already puts the burden on the state to justify its actions, because generally, unless someone challenges it, which is unlikely, we would usually accept in debates that violence and coercion is bad, and that we need to justify it. The only way to justify it in the case of the state is through consent. It is justified to enact force on me if I consent to it. And by extension, democracy is the way we consent to state actions. Voting is the mechanism by which we give the state the mandate to enact force on us. So this is one of the common justifications for democracy and why undemocratic acts are unjustified. moving on to the next slide, I will want to talk about some difficulties with it, which will also be useful for us in debates. So can we move a slide? Yeah, so problems with the state power principle. Firstly, the problems deriving from voting, as in the link that says voting is an extension of consent, is a very dodgy one. Several key reasons for this. First one, an obvious one, is majoritarianism, or the common blame towards democracy that it is the tyranny of the majority. Not all voters consented. The extension that says, as an individual, I am allowed to concede to you enacting force on me does not extend to say that as two individuals, Lucie and I are justified in deciding that you should enact force on Matt. So this is one problem with this principle. The second one is the fact that we all live in representative democracies as opposed to direct democracy, meaning that I don't actually give my consent to every single issue. I have to make a lot of compromises and end up choosing one leader that I hope will keep their promises during the elections period, and then end up doing some things that I do like and some things that I don't. So we don't actually give direct consent to any of state actions. Thirdly, the public choice theory. I imagine Naomi will talk about it more in the part about like lobbyism and stuff, but the TLDR is most issues are not actually decided by the consent of majority of people in democracy, but rather by lobbyists. The basic rationale for why this is the case is individuals are very uninformed and rationally uninformed when it comes to democracy. The amount of power you have as a single voter given millions of votes to determine the election results is so minuscule, and the amount of time that it requires to learn all of the history, economic, security, and everything involved in state decisions is massive. So most of us don't bother, which means most decisions are going to be pushed by people who actually have a heavy interest to invest this time, which are usually lobbyists and pressure groups. Fourthly, we just have very limited choices. In some countries, it's as little as 2, such as in the US, and even in parliamentary systems, parties tend to gravitate towards the center. So even if we have multiple parties, it's usually not in their incentive to be massively different and radical, because then they would get less votes. And the more proximate you are to the central voter, the more voters you're likely to get. This means that our choice in the first place is between very few options that are very similar in nature, meaning that this is not a very meaningful choice. Fifthly, elections only tend to happen every 4 or 5 years. It sometimes differentiates between what the country it is. In my country, it happened once every year or 2 in some parts of our nation. But, you know, in any case, it's definitely not something that you can constantly reinforce and take your government out at the moment that it displeases you. And lastly, low voter turnout. We know that in the US, we traditionally have less than 50% voter turnout. In most countries, it doesn't go much higher than 80%, meaning that a lot of people are coerced by the state without actually giving their consent. What are some solutions or mitigations to these problems that we can use and are sometimes the heart of debates? A few technical ones to start. First, primary elections process. The reason that it helps us become more representative and more fulfilling of the actual mandate is because this means that rather than just have the limited very few options within parties that tend to gravitate towards the center, we have more of our option to promote our own candidates within political parties that help represent our more specific and niche opinions. Secondly, accountability that is withheld not only through voting. So the classical case would be via media reporting, protests, demonstrations, etc. So many forms in which we can enact our accountability towards the government, not just via voting. Referendums, in some cases, to avoid the problems discussed about public choice theory, about the fact that we only vote once every 4 or 5 years and not on every specific issue, but only on representative individuals that are going to decide on every issue. Constitution, which helps limit the power of the state to take control over our autonomy. Supreme courts, and by the way, this may be relevant in a lot of judicial debates that you may have on things such as judicial activism or non-formalism, and whether or not it is justified for the court to intervene in, say, abortions or gay marriage, etc. And we need to justify why it is legitimate to do despite technically being undemocratic, because Supreme Court judges are not democratically represented. kind of complicated. Sometimes they are voted in, but they are not really voted out. And one of the key justifications for this would be based on it, to say that democracy, in fact, fails and is not representative. And the way to fix it is through the Supreme Court intervention, to fix for the fact that on many issues, the public doesn't really vote or doesn't really know, etc. And this is, in fact, a real manifestation of what they would have wanted had they had a choice. Parliamentary systems as preferable and more representative to two-party systems, policies that increase turnout, and less two ones, which might be the strongest ones if done properly, because they're less technical and more inherent to deal with many issues. One is using analysis of intensity of preferences. So in this, we say we are willing to compromise the fact that people are not going to vote on many issues. All of you have some stuff that you prioritize when you go out and vote. We don't vote usually on specific things such as the price of every small topic or some religious freedom or another, but we prioritize what's important to us. For some of us, it's security. For some of us, it's the minority rights of the specific minority that we are relevant to. And here, this is basically the case pro-lobbyism. Lobbyism is not just negative in the sense that we all think of like big corporations using it to abuse their power, but it also means that sometimes it gives rightfully more power to small groups that otherwise wouldn't have power because they use their intensity of preferences to push their agenda against what a majority maybe wouldn't support because of racism or whatnot, but don't have strong enough feelings about to vote on. And this basically goes to justify why majoritarianism, or the problem that we don't actually vote on all issues, is fine and legitimate. Because if you don't prioritize something highly enough in your intensity of preferences, maybe we shouldn't really ask you. Maybe we should prioritize someone else. The second one is the idea of liberalism and minimal state intervention. This is the classical libertarian case. Which basically says, since the state is very, very forcing, and there are so many issues with democracy, the best way to avoid it is to make the state as minimalist and less interventionist as possible, so as to allow people to have maximum freedom in their own individual life. So we justify the state intervention in the extremes, either when there is a very massive consensus or when allowing your own rights has to infringe on my rights, such as in the case of banning murder. But we don't have the state intervene in stuff that are very controversial and might lead to unfair infringement of autonomy. Next slide. The second issue with the state power principle is one which basically challenges the last link, the second link. So violation of autonomy doesn't always require consent. There are many reasons we use to justify infringement of autonomy, even on an individual level. The trivial one would be we are justified in infringing on someone's consent if otherwise they would infringe on mine. So it is legitimate to use violence to prevent violence. This is basically an extension of the self-defense principle. Trivially, it is something that can defend things such as we need to ban murder or violent crimes, and we don't even need a democratic mandate for this. I would posit even if majority of the people would vote for murdering a specific group, it should be undemocratic to let them because of this. The more complicated things you can do with this, with some extra steps, can also be used to justify redistributive justice. So this basically means that violence sometimes isn't enacted now, but was in previous generation, aka slavery in the US, colonialism, etc., meaning that a lot of current structures of inequality are a result of previous force that was done in previous years. And as an extent of how we justify self-defense, or more accurately in this case, reparations, we should also give legitimacy to the state to take money from some people and transfer it via welfare to others, because in fact this money was initially acquired in an illegitimate way. Next slide. Social contract, I will get to in a separate slide because time, and in this I will also discuss a bit more the upgraded version of the social contract, because I think without the upgraded version it's quite a weak argument. I think the hardest potential justification of intervening with autonomy is one that is just based on human stupidity. So again, I use the same logic as I used at the beginning, which is trying to understand when do we legitimize or don't legitimize an action on the individual level and then extending it to the government. And just like with an individual, we often think that it is justified to intervene if they do something that is extremely stupid and against their interest. The classic example you all learned in your novice year was hard drugs. So we are legitimate in banning people from taking heroin, for example, because even if it is technically their choice, it's not free, not rational, often ill-informed, etc. So in rare cases, this principle can also be extended to the public. The reason I say rare is it's quite a heavy burden to say that the majority of the public is stupid and you know better. But you can prove in certain circumstances that there are significant pressures that lead the public to otherwise irrational decisions or votes. So such as during a pandemic, when people for some reason think that mask wearing is not really necessary, or during an economic crisis where people are often very short-termist, you can justify going against the popular vote and doing things that are quote unquote undemocratic in the greater benefit of the public as an extension of autonomy. So if they would be more rational and more informed, they would have voted for it themselves. Next slide. Social contract. Not a fan, but let's go through the weak version and then try to strengthen it a bit. There's an unsigned, unspoken agreement between all members of a society in which we respect certain rights, including the legitimacy of the state and all of us wanting to live under a state. As an extension of this, if someone violates their contractual obligations, like not paying their taxes, it is legitimate for us to sanction them because they quote unquote unsigned a contract, and this justifies it. Let's go through the issues. I think they're going to be intuitive. Next slide. First issue, bid my language. When the fuck did I sign this contract? I think this is the most trivial issue with the social contract argument. None of us actually signed it. The solution to this, and I'm jumping already to the solution because I think this will help explain the future issues better. Try and use the logic of tacit consent. This is something that comes from kind of the legal grounds, but basically we all sign unsigned contracts all the time. When you go on a taxi, you don't sign any contract that says you're going to pay your taxi driver by the end of the ride. But it is clear to all of us that you have formed an obligation to it. It is expected by both sides that this happens. A society needs tacit consent contracts to survive. It is impossible to make every single agreement between all individuals in society be signed on a paper contract. And as an extension of it, we can say that even if I didn't technically sign this, by participating in a society, I consent to a lot of the agreements within it that are social conventions, even if I didn't technically write on any paper. This is why other issues we would use are more specific to the case of the social contract and not just generally against tacit consent. So one is contracts, even tacit ones, tend to have an opt-out. This doesn't seem to really happen in the case of the state. I can opt out of using a taxi. I can use the bus. I can walk. I can't really just leave my state. It's really hard. It would be especially harder if I wouldn't be fortunate enough to have a dual citizenship, which is the case of most people. And even then, it is really hard in terms of economic situation, familial ties, etc. Secondly, opt-in is also really questionable. I never entered this taxi, if we continue using the analogy. I didn't choose where to be born. I was a kid when it happened and when all of these norms were forced on me. And a large part of it was signed before I was even born, aka the Constitution in many countries. And these are things that are extremely hard to change through the slow and bureaucratic legal process. All of these make the justification of social contract really difficult. Some ways in which we can try and strengthen it and answer this. One would be with policies that try to maximize the opt-out option. So these are through things like financial, legal, and educational aid in migration out of a country. There is a motion about that. Does the state have an obligation to help people migrate out? This is often also done through things like maximizing local autonomy. So this is an extension of what I said earlier. It is hard for me to move from Israel to Germany. It is easy for me to move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or for someone else to move from London to Exeter or whatever. So if the state maximizes the local authorities' autonomy, it could be said to increase people's opt-out because it means more decisions are made by authorities that they can more easily opt out of. This is the justification, for example, used often in the United States to defend why the federal state intervenes little with what the local states do. Maximizing opt-in, this is usually done via improving the democratic process by making consent more valid, by making voting more meaningful, all of the things we said earlier. And it also, one more thing is trying to make the law more representative of actual social norms and preferences. So this is via allowing flexible changes to the legislation. It kind of goes against constitution sometimes. Time-capped policies is something that comes up in many motions. Should we make a policy that will only be enacted for 4 years and then need to be voted on again? Lower entry barriers to making political change. So things such as lowering the democratic threshold for a party to enter parliament. Next slide. Okay, the last one I'm going to talk really briefly, and I think I'll probably only have time for the actual argument and less time for the problems with the argument, but I think that's fine because I think making the actual argument is the thing that most of you have more difficulties with. So a lot of people struggle defending technocracies or otherwise non-democratic regimes in debates, despite many debates forcing it in many ways. I think the way to go at it, and I'm assuming here a technocracy meaning some form of a good or benevolent ruler or a qualified individual rather than, you know, just a generic dictatorship that is also very bad in what it does. But here is basically the idea where we try to weigh utility and the state doing what is smart over representation. So there's a hard claim and then an easier claim deriving from it. The hard claim that you can prove sometimes is that the difference between action and inaction is always arbitrary. The easier claim, which I would recommend taking as the lower burden, is that the difference between action and inaction is arbitrary specifically from the perspective of the government. So due to the existence of a monopoly on violence, we prevent people from maximizing their own benefit through their own individual governance. And this makes us complicit in their misery, even when we are not acting, and not just when we are acting against them. Secondly, the great power comes with great responsibility, or the Spider-Man case. This is basically one that is based on neglect. So the analogy that we all like using, like the intuition pump, a kid drowning and we pass by it and let it drown, is it equivalent to murder? And the reasoning we use here to say yes is because usually the reason between action and inaction is the division of responsibility. When I don't donate to a certain cause, everyone around the world also doesn't donate. But if I uniquely had the option to save a drowning child, I had the option between their life and death, I am like a murderer. Similarly, with the state, it has a lot of unique power to save people, making that the fact that it doesn't makes it like complicit. And the state often put people directly in their position of misery, especially in the case of poor people that were often, you know, zoning laws and many other ways in which the state made them disadvantaged in the first place, which makes them actively responsible. Therefore, we can argue the metric of policymaking should be purely utilitarian. So if the state has to violate rights to maximize utility, that's justified, because the other side of this comparison is also violation of rights. On both sides, people suffer, and it's equally important because action and inaction are meaningless from the perspective of the state. And this is why if we have the option for a technocratic state that does better and maximize utility, we have the obligation to do so as well. I think this is the classical defense of it. Lucie, I think we prefer to move on, and if people have questions later on responses to it, I can go back to the next slide, but this is the last principle I wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, like, you can speed through it if you want to, but.
Okay, so in which case I'll take another 2 minutes to go through the problems with this and how to answer them. General problems with the defending technocracy case. The boring but obvious one is it only works if the government is good in maximizing utility. Now, some debates, most debates in fact, because A-teams try to make their motions not completely biased, will give some leeway to assume a generally benevolent and smart and qualified government when these debates are about. What you want to do to then win it still is to show why even a good-purposed, well-intentioned and talented government is likely to make a lot of wrong decisions in a technocracy. One could be through incentives analysis on why power attracts corrupt people and why it corrupts even the good people who started good. The other could be via the problem of information. Even the best ruler and the most talented ruler cannot know everyone's individual preferences if they don't signal it to them via elections. And problems of efficacy, like when you force people to do stuff, you have civil disobedience, you have a lot of bureaucracy and enforcement costs, and this harms efficiency. Important note, and this is how I would also usually advise to answer this attack if you are on the side defending technocracy. The burden in this case is to be comparative. It's not enough if I want to take down the argument we discussed earlier to just prove the government isn't perfect in maximizing utility. I have to show that it is worse than a democracy or a liberal system. Otherwise, the other side still wins on utility. And this is what I usually do to bring back the justification of technocracy. It's enough for me to prove it's better than democracy, and then the only burden I have is to show democracy is really bad in maximizing utility, and that's frankly quite easy. The harder challenge, but maybe the stronger one, is the principal challenge, which is challenging the last link. So the case for neglect doesn't really justify hurting uninvolved individuals. It means that I have the obligation to save a drowning child when it doesn't mean harming anyone else. It doesn't mean that as a doctor that can harbor someone's organs to save 5 other people with them, I am allowed to do so. And this is basically the Kantian case of using others as a means to an end. The fact that the state has a certain obligation doesn't mean that it justifies doing it at the expense of other people who are not to blame. And this is the harder challenge, but if proven, quite an effective one. Cool, I think that's it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacklin. I'll be talking to you about how we analyze countries' incentives. So before I go into my section, I just want to talk about how much we've raised so far. So I think the amount that we've raised actually has increased since Lucie gave you the last update. We've now raised £7,150 towards supporting Ukrainian charities. So congrats, everyone. Let's keep it going. All right, so next slide. So I think after Hadar has done an excellent job at presenting really common principled arguments about politics and about power structures, rebutting them and then rebutting their own rebuttals, I'm going to further complicate things by talking about practicalities and what countries are actually incentivized by and what things actually factor into the power dynamics that structure a country. So I'm going to start in a somewhat unintuitive place, which is policies. So in most democracies, most politics debates are actually going to be policy debates. This is basically because in countries like what we consider Western liberal democracies, mechanisms like voting are seen as self-evident, and the kind of more interesting, more controversial thing to argue about is policy. So what do I mean by policy? Policy is just any set of effects that a country or administration will implement to try to reform or solve a specific problem. So this can be economic, how we distribute welfare. This can be social. How do we ensure, for example, gender equality in a country? This can be related to do with justice. For example, is there a need to reform the criminal justice system? All of these actually engage with political systems of the state and hence policymakers. Debaters tend to be quite reductionist about how this policy-making process occurs. So typically they debate in the following framework. You raise an issue through some social and political mechanism. This may be looking like, writing a letter to your senator or mass protest or even voting. All these social political mechanisms raise an issue to your respective policymaker. Like I want, for example, the criminal justice system to be reformed. Then once your policymaker has been notified by enough people in that constituency, the issue is going to be solved. And so most debates, at least politics debates, are going to be determinative about that social and political mechanism. Who can make people join the protest more, or like which side is going to get more people really motivated to write letters to their MP. So this framework, just so that you're cognizant of it, is what I call the window of opportunity framework. The reason why we call it a window of opportunity is because most policy issues actually aren't spotlighted in the public attention. And when they are spotlighted in the public attention, that creates a very small temporal window in which reform is then possible. So most policy issues are considered very technocratic and a bit dry and boring, even though they're incredibly significant. So things like education and immigration tend to not receive a lot of public attention most times. So when policymakers, i.e. if you're a senator or if you're an MP in parliament, most of these policymakers have limited time. And when you have limited time, you can't pay attention to every policy issue equally. So if something isn't substantive or popular enough to actually warrant public discourse and scrutiny, they tend to be delegated to technocratic specialists that implement incremental changes to education policies or immigration policies. But sometimes a window of opportunity is created. So for example, people go out on the streets because there's a trigger event, like for example, the killings of George Floyd that triggered a huge BLM protests. So when something like a trigger event has happened, a policy issue is then thrown into the spotlight and a window of opportunity is created. Now, when there's huge public discourse and scrutiny around that policy issue, it's not worth it for a policymaker to delegate time towards solving that policy issue because it becomes reflective of their greater performance. So all debaters will typically debate within this framework, who can create the biggest window of opportunity possible and really motivate and incentivize policymakers to actually deal with a policy issue that they otherwise would delegate to someone else. There are ways to contest this. So quite obviously, lots of debates are weighted towards sides that can accrue the most number of people to actually join a protest or to write letters to their MP. There are ways that you can actually contest the efficacy of a broad-based movement in delivering desirable policy outcomes. So you can say that it's not just the number of people raising a fuss about a policy issue that makes a difference, but it's also how this group of people that are talking about this issue actually conceptualize what the problem is. So is the public discussion that's happening actually constructive to solving that policy issue that you flagged? A really great example of this is how we conceptualize and understand problems in the criminal justice system. So it's not enough that you have the entire country talking about problems in the criminal justice system if the ways they understand it are incredibly distorted. So for example, do people understand structures of police brutality as related to a much bigger systemic problem about how poor Black populations are basically criminalized for basically existing, and this warrants kind of the use of excessive force by a highly militarized police force? Or do they conceptualize it as a problem of a few bad eggs in the police force that just need higher amounts of accountability? So it doesn't matter if you have a huge number of people talking about an issue, if they're talking about it in the wrong way, because that just means that when a policymaker finally does pay attention to that policy issue, they're likely going to pass either an ineffective policy that doesn't actually address the root issues of a problem, or they actually pass actively destructive or harmful policies that just make the problem worse. So this is how you do the weighing against scale of your movement that actually incentivizes policymakers to do something versus the ideological inclinations of that movement. So if you ever need to trade off, for example, co-opting conservative feminists to be part of your feminist movement versus just keeping it to a small group of committed leftists or progressives, this is how you do that weigh-off. And so the other things that also affect how whether policy gets passed and what policy is passed is who is in the room. So note that when windows of opportunity are created, they tend to be very, very short. So at most, they're a couple of weeks long, or even maybe a couple of months long. So note that this is not enough time for policymakers to draft bills from scratch. And so typically what they do is they shop for ready-made policy solutions that they feel can address their constituencies' feelings or sentiments or concerns. So this is where bigger organized groups become very highly influential. So think about corporations, think about think tanks. What these organizations typically do is that they have ready-made policy solutions that policymakers can just pick up. Note that you need to be in the room with policymakers to even offer them these policy solutions in the first place. So this means when they do behind the door lobbying, these groups that are actually invited to consult on policy issues become incredibly determinative. So it's not just about having a huge populist movement on the ground, but it's also having organized groups that are able to give policy solutions to policymakers. policymakers. This looks like, for example, in the most extreme scenarios, draft bills that are written by corporations that policymakers just attach their names to. So kind of in the worst case scenario, it looks like that sort of meddling in the democratic process. In the best case scenario, it looks like long devoted, for example, environmental groups that have prepared policy solutions that can now be invited into the policy making process to offer up policy solutions. So next slide, please. Yeah. And so after talking about policy, the reason why I put so much emphasis on it is that I think the electoral power mechanisms of a democracy tend to be quite intuitive. So, if something is a huge policy issue that people care about, if you as an administration don't solve it, your party is going to possibly lose the next local or national election. So this is typically kind of just like what we all intuitively understand how democracies work. But note that we can inject more layers of complexity, right? There's a great quote that I really enjoy, is that it goes like something like, if you want to see the fate of democracies, look outside the window. I look outside the window now, and the conservatives are still in power despite basically really royally screwing up the COVID response that has cost the lives of thousands of people in the UK. So why is it that they are still in power when they have obviously done a really terrible job at what possibly is the most pressing issue that the UK has ever faced in the past few years? And so the reason why is that, at least to the people that are voting, they haven't seemed to have screwed up. So this leads into how people understand or conceptualize certain issues. I kind of hinted to this before when I talked about the criminal justice system and how people understand the problem. Note that lots of people have different value frameworks, and that really affects how they assess the performance of a specific administration. So for people who really cared about preserving individual autonomy, the people who really cared about preserving the performance of the economy, maybe the conservatives did do a really good job. And so the things that actually affect whether or not people are angry enough to vote an administration out of power is contingent on the ability to shape how people value different impacts and value different outcomes and principles in society. And the organizations that typically do that are, for example, media, education, social media platforms. And so those become incredibly determinative in controlling election outcomes. And that's also how parties can also kind of control or coerce how people form their values in the first place, and hence how they assess their own performance. Cool. And I think there's going to be more talk on that a little bit later. So I'll leave it to the next trainer. Next slide. Possibly the thing that most people kind of want to hear about is what causes non-democracies or to be in power, and what affects the stability or strength of that power. So note that this is kind of an oversimplification. I kind of made it just seem that democracies exist and non-democracies exist. Note that there is no such thing as a pure democracy. In the same way, there's no such thing as a pure free market and a pure state market. So it's kind of an oversimplification to kind of dichotomize the world's governments into these things. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just assume that non-democracies are states where legal, judicial, military power tends to be centralized within a single figurehead and a strongman, or within a single party. For example, in Singapore, it looks like the PAP. So in these types of administrations or regimes, violence against dissidents tends to be more common. So does political suppression, as well as things like judicial rigging. These are the kind of governments that we're talking about. So what's really important to understand about these kinds of governments is that while they project really strong optical images of stability, of strength, of infallibility, they are actually the opposite. They tend to be highly fragile and unstable. They tend to operate like a house of cards where there is a top tier, but it's supported by a bunch of tenuous and conditional power transactions at the bottom. So what are these power transactions that hold up non-democracies? Well, one of them is oligarchs. Typically in lots of these states, power and wealth tends to be concentrated in just a few specific groups of people. These can either be ethnic groups, these can look like a specific class of people, or people who are involved in a specific industry. These people tend to have huge access to resources and capital that the state requires to survive. This looks like, for example, oil money in Russia, or like, for example, access to global finance in Singapore. So these really wealthy oligarchs and form very important political allies, and tend to form transactional relationships with the strongman or party in charge. They provide wealth, arms, and approval in exchange, for example, getting preferential treatment under the state. For example, they are allowed to just continue being corrupt and embezzling huge amounts of personal wealth out of the country. So these oligarchs have a transactional relationship with the person in power. So once you intervene or impinge on that transactional relationship, it's very likely that this oligarch support breaks down. I'll be talking about that a little later. But also the second thing that I think people really underestimate in non-democracies that are determinative to their success is popular sentiment. Just because something is a non-democracy doesn't mean that people suddenly lose all political agency or any ability to affect the state that they live in. So debaters regularly kind of assume that normal people exercise little to no power within these regimes. But what we see actually is that popular dissent and social disruption can actually lead to huge amounts of instability in a regime. For example, this can look like, for example, market instability. If there are huge protests happening in your capital city, loads of external funders and hence really important wealth disappears from your country. And probably the oligarchs that are in charge lose a lot because of social disruption that leads to market disruption. The next thing that can also happen is, for example, terrorism that threatens the propaganda facade of a state as being seen as highly secure and highly stable. A lot of these kind of like popular based movements actually cause huge amounts of economic, legal, security disruption that the state relies on in order to continue functioning. So popular dissent that we're talking about tends to be triggered by one of two things, or maybe even both. First is what I call bread and butter issues. This is how you materially survive in the world and how comfortable you are surviving in the world. So maybe you tend to be a little bit more okay with an authoritarian regime if you can afford to feed your family, if your kids can go to a really good school, if you can access goods and services that you consider to be like fundamental to a good and happy existence. Once those things go away, you suddenly become a lot more unhappy with the regime or administration in charge. And it may be that you're unhappy enough to actually take it to the streets. The second thing that the popular dissent is typically catalyzed by is propaganda issues. So lots of, like what I said before, people tend to value things in a specific way. They tend to value, for example, security over civil liberties, et cetera, all these trade-offs that people make as part of a value framework is shaped by things like propaganda and by media. And if media suddenly changes how you view or value certain things, that can also lead you to be angry enough with the administration that you take it to the streets. So for example, loads of Russians have now understood that the propaganda line that Putin has been using to invade Ukraine is actually materially completely untrue, which has led to a lot of broad-based popular movements against the war in Ukraine or the invasion of Ukraine. So all these forms of political legitimacy can fit into the issues above. So for example, like religion tends to be very similar to propaganda in how it works to create what people value in life and hence how they feel about an administration. So what I've given you is kind of a broad-based framework in order to understand how these non-democracies work. So how do we actually change the behavior of non-democracies? Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so how do we actually change the behavior of non-democracies? So typically this is, now we're getting to realm of IR debates. So like what actually changes the behavior of a non-democracy? So I'm going to be talking about external sanctions. How do they typically work? So external actors, be it countries, organizations, entire blocks of countries, can pose existential threats to an administration or regime by implementing loads of sanctions. So this can, for example, make the populace hurt. So this is very related to what I talked about before. By affecting the fulcrums of power that these administrations rely on, you can destabilize the administration. So first you can target popular dissidents. So how do people feel about normal people feel about the administration? So normal people in, for example, Russia have already felt the effects of the war in Ukraine. For example, loads of companies have pulled out. They suddenly cannot access a load more of the luxury goods they've become acclimated to. They also feel the effects of a declining economy when everyone gets poor and the money can't afford as much as it used to. So these can trigger people to take to the streets and in turn destabilize destabilize a regime. The second fulcrum of power that these sanctions can hit can look like hitting the oligarchs. So the US has already frozen US-held assets of Russian oligarchs, as well as seizing their assets as well. So this means that oligarchs no longer really highly benefit from a transactional relationship with the figurehead or strongman in charge, and they would pose very little resistance if that figurehead or strongman was replaced by someone else. The figurehead and strongman knows this and is likely going to adjust that behavior if it's making oligarchs of the populace hurt. Note that there are many responses to why sanctions aren't always effective. And Russia in particular has been quite adamant about sanction proofing its economy ever since 2008, 2010. So a couple mechanisms that countries such as Russia use in order to sanction proof their economy or sanction proof their society is the following. First, they've stockpiled loads of foreign currency. So even if your domestic currency, the ruble, the currency that your country uses, even if it declines in strength and you can't buy as much with it anymore, you can rely on the stockpile of foreign currency in order to trade on the international market. For example, you can use American dollars, Japanese yen in order to continue importing the things that you really like and to protect against the devaluation of your home domestic currency. The second one is that Putin has really advised many oligarchs to avoid foreign loans. This is to basically insulate them for any effects of the international market that Russia could possibly feel when sanctions hit. The third one is that you can sell something that is pretty immune to boycotts. So Russia tends to sell a lot of energy and tends to sell a lot of oil. I think it makes up a huge, it makes up like an insane proportion of the economy or something. But when they sell something that is quite price inelastic or quite vital to the global economy, lots of countries, even if they fundamentally disagree with how that state operates, are not willing to sanction that specific good and service in particular. So for example, even though the US has implemented huge amounts of sanctions on Russian goods and services in the Russian economy in general, it has refused to sanction Russian oil specifically. That's because if you sanction Russian oil, the global supply in oil then changes, which then could cause a huge price surge in how much oil costs. And so if something is very fundamental to how the global economy works, this basically sanction proofs your economy to a very large extent, because that means sanctions will never hit the thing that you're exporting. The final one, the strategy that Putin has really pursued is tightening relations with other regimes. So these are regimes that probably will never pursue sanctions against them and will continue consuming a lot of the goods they create. So it's tightened relations with, for example, China that has basically agreed not to sanction it and to continue supporting the Russian economy throughout this war. So there are many mechanisms that make sanctions a lot less effective that you can bring up in a debate, and these are probably it. And so the debate will be settled by whether or not the specific sanction that the motion addresses in particular is sufficient to destabilize the administration or at least threaten it existentially enough such that the figurehead in charge is going to change the behavior. So that's my section over. I'll hand it over to the next trainer now.
Great. Thanks, Jacklin. Thanks, Hadar. Before I get into talking about international relations, which Jacklin just set me up nicely to do, I just want to point out that the fundraiser is now at £7,207. So we really appreciate all of the support. We're incredibly grateful, and please keep it coming throughout the workshop and beyond. I'll be talking about a couple of things. Next slide, please. I'm going to first start by talking about how to case file sensibly and sort of how to utilize that within debate. And then I'm going to be talking about the basics of IR debates, kind of building on what Hadar talked about and what Jacklin talked about, both in terms of what happens at the point at which the preferences of citizens aggregate into countries' decision-making, i.e. incentives, and what kinds of capacities those countries have to execute on those decisions, and how to talk about incentives and capacities of countries within debates. We'll start by talking about case filing sensibly. And I think this is sort of the major barrier that a lot of people have to approaching IR debates, especially when first starting out, but it can often be something that sticks with people throughout a debate career. And I think the issue is that IR, like econ and finance debates, requires a slightly higher knowledge threshold than a lot of other motion types. That is, there's a certain baseline level of understanding about the way in which countries interact with one another, the way in which the world works in terms of geopolitics, and the way in which different countries are aligned vis-a-vis one another that is important to understand. So it sounds as though you know what you're talking about in a round. But once that baseline is reached, there's usually no need to be an expert on any specific issue. That is, BP debate doesn't demand that you know the intricacies of any specific economic policy in any one country or be able to talk about it like you have a PhD in international relations theory. You're never going to have to reference various international relations theorists when engaging in a BP debate to a large extent. So given that that's the case, the way to sort of reach that knowledge threshold is relatively straightforward. It's to make learning international relations part of your daily routine without making it something that overwhelms you or overwhelms your engagement with IR compared to other types of motions. So I think what you can do is take a bit of time each day prior to debating tournaments or like prior to prep to sort of read specific resources or listen or interact with specific resources that exist on the internet for like a 5 or 10 minute period each day. So what I would do when I was prepping for majors was I would read the Council on Foreign Relations email newsletter that was released daily over my morning coffee or tea. And then I would maybe spend 5 to 10 minutes on days I didn't read that newsletter, looking at credible international relations blogs and websites or other websites. So I've included the link in this presentation, which will be shared after the workshop, but the Council on Foreign Relations email newsletters are a really great starting point for a very short and brief breakdown and digest of various international relations issues. They have a number of newsletters on regional and global topics, so you can look at specific topics like Middle East politics or American politics and subscribe to those newsletters. And they also have some that are more broad in scope, like recent events in the world today, and so on and so forth. You can subscribe to ones that are interesting to you or where you feel you have deficits in knowledge, and those can be pretty useful. Another website tool I like to utilize are news aggregator websites like Google News, for example. What these news aggregators do is they tend to bring a lot of recent news articles from around the web together. And you can key into those news aggregators specific terms in order to see recent news about specific topics. So if you're interested specifically in US-China relations, you can input US-China relations into Google News and you'll see like top news stories from around the internet on that specific issue. Other news aggregator websites might not have that much customizability, but Real Clear World, for example, lists a large number of news articles from around the world, and you can very quickly skim through them and sort of get a digest on different issues. Credible IR blogs and websites are another great place to start as well. This looks like Brookings or Foreign Policy, the LSE International Relations blog, and so on and so forth. Or podcasts. Those aren't really my thing, but many people like them. The point is that they are digestible. They are things you can do in your spare time, and it's stuff that isn't overwhelming to learn about, and you can consistently expose yourself to each day. Once you've kind of gotten that baseline understanding of IR, it becomes quite easy to make a lot of different inferences about how countries work. Because once you understand sort of a set baseline that these news sources tend to equip you with, it tends to have diminishing marginal returns in terms of researching incredibly specialized things about individual countries. So once you have this baseline, you're usually able to make smart inferences about how these countries work and what is necessarily then required to argue about them in debates. In terms of case filing, this is something that a lot of people like to do for IR. My general perspective on case files is that they're somewhat overrated insofar as when you're in a debate, you have 15 minutes to prepare. And if 5 of those minutes are taken up by thumbing through your matter file, looking for the specific topic in question, like US-Iran relations, you're probably going to lose out on prep time that you could have used to predict what the other side was going to say, or come up with creative mechanisms about how this motion will play out in practice. However, there are a few things you might actually want to have on hand that are pretty useful in terms of international relations case file stuff. I think the first thing is like a printed list of the Wikipedia article on current world leaders. Nothing's more awkward when you reference Benjamin Netanyahu as the Prime Minister of Israel in debate today, which has happened in recent debates that I've watched, only to find out that he's recently been removed from power through an election. Given that that is the case, you probably want to make sure that you don't make that mistake in debates, and so having that on hand can be reasonably helpful for making quick references. If you have any terminology that you're unfamiliar with as well, it's useful to keep notes on that. So if you don't know what ASEAN is, or the AIIB, or SWIFT is, for example, or you don't know what that acronym means off the top of his head in the associated organization, then it's probably useful to have that on hand as well. Some people also really like maps. Maps can be useful as well for sort of placing where countries are in relation to one another in order to understand sort of like how the dynamics of a country's geographic location can impact its relationships with other countries. Generally speaking, you want these case files to be somewhat small, because the larger the case file, the more tempted you are in prep probably to search through it. And that's probably usually a waste of time for the reason that you have a very limited amount of time to sort of go through all of that. Instead, what I think you can do in the absence of case filing is to memorize a lot of mechanisms that recur in multiple international relations debates. For example, Jacklin just gave you a lot of mechanisms in the last section of the workshop about sanctions debates and how various forms of sanctions can be utilized to pressure non-democracies to change their behavior. These sanctions debates occur very frequently in a lot of contexts and with a lot of different countries, and memorizing those mechanisms is probably a better use of your time than trying to print out every single article on US-China relations that has ever existed to add it to a printed case file. Next slide, please. So with that out of the way, I'm just going to give a rundown on how to not say silly things about countries. I think there are a couple common mistakes that debaters tend to lapse into. Mistake one, giving a history lesson instead of an argument. What this is it's when debaters substitute analysis for fact claims and make those fact claims the exclusive or majority of their case. Saying lots of facts about a place that you know, while interesting, is not a replacement for analysis in a debate. So it's important to make sure that when you're claiming something that the average intelligent voter can't be expected to know, that is a claim that would make international news headlines in newspapers, to justify that fact claim with an analytical justification for why it is true. So explaining why something that you claim about a country is true in structural terms, rather than just making inferences or references to a specific article you read once or a statistic cited in some journal somewhere or something like that. The second common mistake that I want to highlight is making assertions about incentives. This is closely related to the first thing, which is about making fact claims in the absence of an argument. But even if you're able to prove that an actor in an international relations debate like a country does have an incentive and has the requisite capacity to carry out the action the incentive demands, it's important to note that incentives don't tend to exist in isolation. That is, even if you prove that a country has an incentive to do something, it might not be the overriding incentive, or it might not be the most proximate incentive to decision makers in the country that ends up like influencing the way that they make the decision in the long term. So even if a country has an incentive and wants something to happen, it is unclear that that incentive will ultimately be what the country decides to do if there's a more proximate incentive that the country cares about more. For example, the United States might care very deeply about projecting power into Asia to counter regional geopolitical rivals. But it's equally possible that the US has a stronger countervailing incentive to, I don't know, focus on international relations in Europe or shore up domestic support for its leaders by promoting international isolationism and moving manufacturing jobs and various forms of economic power back home rather than projecting it abroad. These incentives might be stronger incentives than projecting power into Asia. We don't know without the analysis. So proving that an incentive exists in isolation is still a mistake insofar as you don't weigh it off against other potential incentives or incentives that other teams raise in debates. Another thing that often happens is in relation to making assertions about incentives is claiming X actor is just irrational. This often occurs in debates about North Korea, where a common refrain in lower rooms is, well, Kim Jong-un is just crazy. That's why he keeps launching nukes into the Pacific. He just is insane and you can't reason with a madman. This is almost never persuasive and is often inequitable, and recognizing this and analyzing and weighing it accordingly is quite important. Generally speaking, even if leaders happen to make decisions in a manner that seems to an outside observer, very counterintuitive to their geopolitical interest. There is often a rationale for why they did so, and there is often a rationale that you can analyze for why they opted to make that decision that is likely to be more persuasive than simply stating the binary that the motion is undebatable or the claim is unpersuasive because the actor itself or the actor themselves is just a fundamentally irrational one. Typically, states often behave or usually behave according to a variety of predetermined incentives. And even when they make suboptimal choices, it's usually the case that they make those choices with the recognition that there is a rational decision-making calculus behind those decisions. So recognizing what the rational decision-making calculus could be, even if it ultimately led to a suboptimal decision, will usually strengthen your analysis and make you weigh over teams that make more reductive claims about countries' behavior. I think the third mistake, and this is sort of the first two are sort of subsets of these, are making very sweeping generalizations, right? Because often IR rewards nuance and recognizing that there is a degree of nuance to leaders of countries' incentives, and that these incentives don't exist in a vacuum and are often subject to a variety of countervailing decision-making processes, and a variety of different incentives exist not in a vacuum, tends to get points and tends to help you weigh over teams that don't do that. So while IR is not necessarily just a competition between who knows the most facts in the abstract or who knows the most things about a specific country, being able to present a very nuanced take about a country's stance on an issue is likely to, one, just earn you points in terms of the eyes of the judges who see you're analyzing the country not just in isolation, but from multiple perspectives, but also is just likely to demonstrate that you understand potential objections that could be raised to your case by other teams, and set your second speaker, for example, up to refute that, or set yourself up to preempt that with preemption material later on in your own speech. Next slide, please. Some IR basics then. And this builds off of what the last trainer talked about in terms of talking about, firstly, how preferences tend to be at the sort of political level aggregated into decisions that accrue at the country level. So international policy is often it often stems from the will of the people, and also off of the material regarding sanctions debates and the way in which those tend to be debated. Most IR debates, or many IR debates, boil down to analyzing the incentives and the capacities of the actor. That is, especially when it's an actor motion, that is, this house as X country would do Y, or this house as X would do Y, often tends to boil down to the incentives and capacities of those leaders. So when we're talking about incentives in debates, we simply mean what the actor, which is often a country like Britain or China, a multilateral organization like ASEAN, the EU, or the UN, or a non-state political faction like a multinational social movement, want. So what does this actor want? Why do they want it? And what informs those wants? All of these are facets of analysis, incentives analysis. Importantly, incentives can be informed by a variety of factors. So a country or a leader might have political or military ambitions that influence its incentives. They might be prone to following a specific ideology or believe in that ideology. They might be afraid of something happening and therefore acting in order to preempt that. There might be a crisis that they're responding to, like the coronavirus or a war, that leads them to making a specific decision. Also importantly, actors tend to have multiple incentives. So often incentives can operate at cross purposes with one another, or those incentives can be subordinate to other more proximate incentives. So debate is often about evaluating between various incentives, and motions are about setting up two clashes between two sides, one with an incentive on one side and one with an incentive on the other side, and then evaluating which incentive is likely to be the more important one and which incentive overrides the other incentives in the context of the motion. So often teams will present equally compelling arguments as to why an actor X has a specific incentive. So on a motion like this house believes that the United States should pursue deeper economic integration with China, government might say a lot of things about how the United States has an overwhelming incentive to increase its economic capital within Asia, to make its companies expand, gain more money, and so on and so forth, and to project power into Chinese markets, and so on. And opposition might claim that the US actually has a very populist stance on this matter, wants to bring manufacturing jobs home, wants to redirect a lot of investment that's currently going overseas into companies that exist at home, domestic United States companies, and so on and so forth. Crucially, the team that wins this debate is likely the team that proves that one of those incentives overrides the other incentive, or that one of those incentives is more important to the actor than the other incentive, or ought to be more important to the actor than that incentive, if this is an actor debate, of course. So analyzing those different incentives, how they interact with one another, which ones are subordinate or secondary incentives to other incentives that an actor might have, and which ones sort of are the most important to that actor, are probably quite helpful. The second branch of IR analysis then, or an analyzing countries, is our capacities analysis. So capacities are the capabilities that an actor possesses in order to fulfill its set incentives. And then further to that, how those capabilities then work, in what context they're utilized, and in what context they're likely to be successful. Capacities can take on many forms, right? So you can have military capacities. Those are countries' armies, their weapons, their technological advantages. Diplomatic capacities, these can be like negotiations, treaties, or alliances like NATO. And economic capacities, so currency reserves, the capacity to sanction a country, and so on and so forth. These are trade ties as well, and so on. Next slide, please. So sort of to break this down then, I've already given some motion examples on the previous slide, but I'm going to take an IR motion and sort of run you through some basic incentives and capacities analysis in order to sort of explain how this can play out in practice in a debate. So this is an example of this IR actor motion that is sort of standard, that you see a lot, and most importantly is sort of cross-applicable to other actors as well. So this motion could also be, this House, as the EU, would prioritize economic engagement with North Korea instead of demanding nuclear disarmament. Could also be phrased as a different country with a different actor, like US as Iran, would prioritize economic engagement with Iran, for example. These motions recur with different actors often in debates. So in this motion, this House, as the US, would prioritize economic engagement with North Korea instead of demanding nuclear disarmament. Teams could claim the US has the following incentives if they are on the government side. They could claim that the US wants to ensure political stability on the Korean Peninsula and to mitigate and reduce tensions between its ally, South Korea, and the DPRK in order to prevent potential conflict or diplomatic strife. They could also claim, secondarily, that the US has the incentive to ensure the passage of humanitarian aid and so on, to make sure economic crises like famine don't accrue in North Korea, because if that economic crisis like famine accrues, this could create significant instability within the North, which could cause instability in a region that is quite important politically to them, insofar as the US cares about projecting influence and power in Asia, both economic and political. And thirdly, you could claim that they have the incentive to avert diplomatic crises that could cause political problems for the US with other regional powers, namely China. So in order to justify how the US could act on those capacities, if you're on-side government on this mission, the US has a variety of capabilities. Some of those capabilities are conditioning aid, right? So conditioning economic aid to North Korea on specific humanitarian reforms, like better treatment of dissidents, and so on and so forth. I think the second thing would be to utilize its military and resource distribution networks in order to make sure aid is delivered in sufficient scale, and to make sure there are sort of checks and balances on aid to make sure it's not appropriated by the North Korean elite for its own purposes, but rather actually does do the work of reducing harm on the ground to like the North Korean people. And then a third argument that could be raised is that they could fund other counters to North Korean nuclear development rather than just demanding nuclear disarmament. So rather than making aggressive demands to Kim Jong-un to reduce his nuclear program, they could fund the Terminal High Altitude Area Missile Defense System in South Korea, or fund similar missile defense systems in other regional allies near North Korea, and so on and so forth. So this argument could be framed as like the US has other capacities by which they can reduce the degree to which North Korean nuclear weapons are a problem, at which point they should probably prioritize economic engagement insofar as it's less of a worry to them that they develop a nuclear weapon in the first place. And they should probably prioritize their incentive, which is to sort of ensure economic stability, over the incentive to prevent North Korea from getting more nuclear weapons insofar as they already have that, and they can fund counters in other ways. So to recap sort of what I've talked about, I've spoken about the basics of case filing and where it's most important and most crucial to case file in order to succeed at IR debates, provided a number of resources that you can sort of start off with IR debates on in order to sort of begin a sort of daily if you wish, exercise regimen to look at IR. And then I've talked about sort of the underpinning analysis of incentives and capacities that underpins a lot of IR debates, especially IR actor debates. I'll hand it over to the next trainer, but if you have any questions, I'll be around following the workshop and we'll be happy to take them at the end. Thanks so much.
Okay, so moving on to the next section. So just before I start, we are currently at, let me refresh, 7,231. So thanks a lot for everyone who's donated. Please keep it coming. We're going to be closing the fundraiser a little bit after the workshop in this evening. So if you want to donate, please make sure you do it before it's going to be too late. Cool. With that, then, if I can get next slide. So I'm going to be talking about political processes. Me and Naomi are going to be splitting it. So the stuff that I'm going to be talking about has mainly to do with voting and voters and how to analyze how people vote, what are their incentives, considerations, etc. So the first slide that I want to talk about then is in terms of barriers to voting. So in most democracies, the sort of ideal of the principle would be to have some sort of one person, one vote system. So I think Hadar has already given reasons as to why that would be principally the thing that is desirable. So having each person having a vote and that those votes would ideally matter equally. Obviously, I think already from what was mentioned previously in the workshop, that is not always the case. So I'm just going to elaborate, maybe add some more reasons specifically from the voter perspective. So I very vaguely divided it into sort of three categories. So starting with, we have sort of formal barriers to voting. So obviously, some people literally can't vote. So very obvious examples, kids under 18, or immigrants who do not have citizenships yet in some countries. From country to country, it might be, for example, prisoners. There might be some kind of direct discrimination on sort of ethnic, religious basis. In these cases, then people literally are forbidden to vote, even if they wanted to. The second sort of formal barrier is cases where voting is being made unnecessarily difficult. So there can be things like requiring ID that might be difficult for many people to acquire. It might be voting booths being really far away from each other, so people would need to travel large distances that they maybe can't afford to do. It might be voting being scheduled in like work days and stupid hours, so a lot of people can't take time off work to go and vote. Because of that, you would often have a situation where even though you don't forbid those people to vote, effectively they can't vote even if they wanted. So I would call that the sort of formal barriers. Second category is in terms of lost votes. So that might be safe seats. If you live in a country like the UK, you would have the country kind of split into a bunch of constituencies, and in each constituency you would have a vote, and then the party that gets the biggest percentage of votes would end up having their representative from that constituency. So even if perhaps you do not get, in some cases, you don't get the majority, if you end up having the biggest percentage, you end up getting the representative and the rest doesn't get represented at all. So in those cases, the votes of the people who are voting for the party that doesn't win ends up getting lost. A more shady example of that can be gerrymandering. That's probably a bit more prominent or known from the US. So that can be sort of drawing the constituency lines in ways that are trying to prevent specific groups from being able to vote. So say you would have like a large area of, say, people from a specific minority who would maybe want to vote for a party X, but instead of drawing the constituency in a way where all of these people are voting together, you would like shadily kind of cut that big area and yeet them each into a different surrounding area along with a large majority population. So at that point, those people are going to become minority in each of those constituencies you divided them into, while if they stay together, they would probably be a quite important voting bloc. So that's another way in which votes get lost because of that tactic. Importantly, it is not just that happens, but it often also is a sort of a discouraging reasons why people don't vote in the first place. So if I live in a constituency where I know that the Conservatives are always going to win, and I want to vote for whichever other party, I might not want to do it in the first place because I feel like, well, I'm going to go and like wake up and go vote, even though it's not going to matter whatsoever. So that's one reason as to why people often don't go and don't vote. Similarly, even outside of these cases of safe seats in any sort of political system, often people just feel that their vote is not important. because I'm just one person. There's so many people. It doesn't really matter who I vote because, you know, I'm just one piece in loads of people. So at that point, again, a lot of people give up on the idea that they should be putting time into voting. The last section I'm calling voter apathy, but I'm putting apathy in quotation marks. The reason being that I think often the following reasons that I'm going to talk about are referred to as voter apathy, or are kind of like being sound as if that's what it is, but often those reasons are actually not that the people are not interested. They go a little bit deeper. So obviously people not being interested in politics is an option and it might happen, but I think also very commonly it might be things like lack of information. So being able to make sort of an informed political choice is something that might require an amount of research. It might require sort of access to education, both for the information, but also maybe for, you know, like getting the kind of narrative that voting is really important that often comes at school. And this is not something that is accessible for everyone. So because of that, I think this particularly affects people who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, when you perhaps have to work for longer hours, didn't have the access to that education. So for those reasons, you do not have the information, and at that point, you don't want to, you don't vote as a result. It might be also that people don't have the ability to relate to candidates. So if every candidate like basically looks like the same like guy with gray hair, if you are maybe from a minority, or you might be a woman or gender minority or anything of that sort, you might not feel that that person can represent you because the lived experience that they have is just very far from yours, or you can't imagine them being able to actually sort of consider your needs properly. So because of that, people sometimes give up on politics because they just don't see themselves represented on that higher level. It might also be because some groups are just not being campaigned towards, so they don't get motivated by parties to go and vote. I think Naomi is going to talk a bit more about that in her section, so I'm just going to point us to, and then you can hear the more detail in a bit. But also, I think lastly, just disillusionment. So what that might mean is, if I'm going to live in a country and then I witnessed all of those parties in power and it seems like all of them are being kind of shit, what I might end up feeling is that it doesn't matter who I vote. It doesn't matter who I vote for. The problem is that it's always going to be garbage, so I'm going to just give up on voting. So given that I give you the shopping list now, where is this potentially useful? So obviously, I think the way that there are already reasons that Hadar gave you, and you can use these reasons similarly to insert it into the principle in the ways that she explained to you. But I think in addition to that, I think in many cases, sort of election debates or debates that have to do with changing voting are trying to sort of figure out how do we achieve representation, how we achieve it well. So what is useful is to characterize what these sort of existing barriers to perfect representation are, so you can explain why your policy is making that representation worse or better. So for example, if this sounds too abstract, maybe if you have a motion such as this House would allocate votes inversely proportional to a voter's wealth, so the people who have less wealth will have more votes. Obviously, there is a range of arguments you can make about maybe, you know, that would be principally good if they actually did have more power. But you can also try to analyze that currently, in the current system, those people for these reasons do not have as much power, and their vote doesn't matter as much as it should. And once you would do this policy, it would kind of repair for it, because maybe they would have no more incentive because they feel that their vote matters, maybe because there would be an incentive, you know, to provide education on the part of the parties, etc., etc. So that's one applicability. Or opposition on this House would only now allow individuals who pass the political awareness exam to vote. If you are opposition, you want to maybe claim things like, because of the reasons that we know about lack of information and lack of time to get that information being a problem for letting people be represented, if you also make them take the political awareness exam, it might cut off even more people who are maybe from poor backgrounds, and they definitely won't have time to go and study for an exam because And I think secondly, it might help you in analyzing parties' incentive. So often debaters say that parties have this electoral incentive. They will do this because, you know, they want to get re-elected. I think sometimes that's the assumption that they just going to get re-elected by like getting 51% of the population voting for them. But I think it is useful to understand who are the groups that parties are likely going to be targeting when it comes to wanting to be re-elected, if we understand which groups are voting and which groups are less likely to be voting. So on that basis, you can do quite nice analysis about parties' incentive. I hope all of that makes sense. If you have any questions, if we have time at the end, just drop them in the chat and we will try to answer. Otherwise, can I have the next slide? Yeah, okay. So we talked about the people who don't vote. Now let's talk about the people who do vote and how they vote. So very common mistakes that debaters make, especially when they are newer, is to either sort of analyze voters as either they are like really rational, meaning those people vote one based on their economic interests and that alone, but also they have very perfect information about everything basically. Or the other way around, and I think Matt already kind of explained why this is not a great idea, to claim that voters are irrational, they just, you know, like really gullible and they don't know what they're doing and they're just voting on a whim. So obviously the truth is somewhere in between, i.e. I think most people vote on some sort of rational basis based on the kind of information that they have that might not be perfect. So couple ways in which you can try to analyze how voters vote. So the first one is sort of explaining voters voting on the basis of different priorities. So when you're making a decision to vote for party A, it's maybe not that you're going to gather your opinion on all 150 issues that might be existing, that policies would be, you know, produced on, and then you like make some sort of aggregate and but instead we often have one or two issues that are really important to us and we vote on the basis of that issue. So for many people, it might be what's most sort of proximate to them. So that might be the economic interests. For some people, it's a single issue, say if you are maybe from a minority group and that really affects you, people might be voting on that basis as well. The one thing I would know is that it's not that the priorities come, the priorities don't have to be necessarily always fully rational either. It's often that those priorities are often constructed for us. What I mean by this is, example of this might be the, for example, the war on terror. So, or if you remember around the 2014, 2015, when terrorist attacks used to be quite, used to happen quite commonly in Europe. In many cases, people were voting on the basis of security very, very often, even if you look at it from like very pure, you know, number basis. The likelihood of you being personally affected by that is perhaps lesser than being affected by taxes. But because the way that often that issue is presented in media or presented in education, or like how people around you are talking about it, you might construct, or the priorities list is sort of constructed for you in a way that maybe is not like a fully perfect list of what actually impacts you the most, if that makes sense. But this is useful. So this is often, I think often I use this in rebutting arguments that people make on various motions that goes in along the lines of sort of, we're going to do this policy and now this policy will affect the rich people and now the rich people are going to vote for it. So if that makes no sense to you yet, to give an example, if you have the motion, this House would require all defendants in criminal cases to be represented only by state-employed lawyers. Often people say, aha, but now the rich people, they can't get their, you know, really good lawyer. Now they have to use the state-employed lawyers. So what they're going to do is they're going to go and they're going to vote to fund the judicial system more. So I'm not saying that running this sort of argument is a wrong choice, and often that argument can be really, very strong. But I think a way that you can try to deal with that argument is to say something like, look, most rich people probably don't have the idea of being on trial and having a lawyer as the biggest priority that they have, right? Like most people don't think they're ever going to be on trial. Most people don't think they're going to be criminals. And if they do, they will think that they're going to be smart and they're not going to get caught. So as like if I'm a rich businessman and I care about my taxes, and that's the thing that really affects me on my day-to-day life, I'm not going to change the way I'm voting, or I'm not going to devote loads of time to lobby for judicial system if that's just really, really low on my priorities list. Second kind of idea is to explain that people often vote on values. So again, these are to an extent constructed. So perhaps the narratives that exist in the society, what is in the media, what is being told to you in education, might be something that that you are going to be perceiving as your value, even though it might potentially go against your interest or whatever. But this is a way that you can try to explain perhaps why some people seemingly vote like irrationally against their interests. So I think in many cases we know people who are quite wealthy and they would probably benefit from big tax cuts, but they still vote for a party that is very pro redistribution. Reason being that the value that they are holding is that this is something that is important, or vice versa, right? If you really care about liberty, perhaps even if you yourself are in a bad economic situation and like big, safety nets would benefit you, you might just be opposed to redistribution on that basis. And that might be the values that you hold, but also the values that are being sort of constructed for you. So if you live in a country that has a lot of like the American dream narrative, perhaps that's something that becomes a value that you are going to start voting on, even if it might seem irrational to some. Thirdly, you might be voting based on predictions rather than current circumstances. So, for example, like I grew up in a country that was developing at that point quite quickly, but I lived in like a very impoverished area. In many cases, people were voting for a very sort of right-wing tax-cutty party, even though they were very, very poor. Reason being that they just believed that before the next election comes, they're going to be rich by then. So sometimes it's that the predictions that you have or the belief that you have about what your circumstances are going to be soon informs how you vote, as opposed to perhaps what your situation is right now. Fourthly, it can be things like party loyalty, peer or family influence. If you are someone who does not have much time on doing research, you might be sort of following what you know that your peers are voting for, what your family was voting for, and on basis of that loyalty. And very lastly, I think it's perhaps voting on the basis of characters, or voting on sort of moral values of the candidate. Again, where is this useful? So one, it's again on analyzing parties' incentive. So for example, if you can analyze what the likely biggest priority of people is, you can also try to analyze where is it that parties are going to be constructing their policies and what they are going to try to target, because they know that people are going to care about it. Secondly, you can analyze the problems with representation. I say problems in quotation marks because we can question whether any of those things are actual problems. But for example, motions such as this House believes that the current system of voting should be replaced by blind voting. This is an analysis that's very useful in explaining why maybe we would need a policy like that to correct for the issues that currently exist. Or analyzing sort of effective campaigning. Example, I think the Euros motion was in functioning democracies with one dominant political party. This House prefers opposition parties to predominantly campaign on the basis of moral character rather than predominantly on specific issues and policies. So this is where you can explain what is the basis on which people are voting and sort of characterizing it, and then explaining why your side or the other side is going to be more effective in reaching to most voters. Cool. So I think that is all from the section that I'm talking to. If you have questions, drop them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Naomi for the final couple slides.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be doing the final section of the workshop, which is part 2 of political processes. We are currently at around £7,260. Given that the workshop is going to be ending soon, if you haven't donated and you have the financial means to, it would be a good time to do so as we end off the workshop. So my section is going to be covering 3 things. So campaigning and certain problems with campaigning, political parties, and specifically how to make arguments about why they are a positive or negative force in politics. And then finally talking about some lobbying issues in more detail and kind of using some like political science concepts to make more nuanced lobbying arguments. consultants. So on the first section about political campaigning, I'm just going to start by characterizing it a bit about what the campaigning process looks like. So as is briefly being alluded to in the seminar thus far, a lot of campaigning is not about very detailed policy issues, but rather it's often about having a core campaign message that is very easy to sell to voters. There's extremely robust campaign machines that exist. So it's not just like a candidate runs and then they discuss their policies in a debate, but it's almost like a business structure with all the effort that goes into the campaigning process. So for example, you have political consultants who advise campaigns on virtually all of their activities, which are things about candidate research, voter research, and its methods that can translate into the most effective kind of campaigning. Campaigns often hire media managers who also do research and then decide what's going to be the most effective message in terms of communicating things to the public. I think something important to note is that there's both the formal campaign team who is being hired by a candidate or political party, and there's also informal campaigning that happens as well with people who support a particular candidate or party and then kind of take it upon themselves to try and get that candidate elected. So these are often volunteer activists and foot soldiers who do a lot of canvassing and like door-to-door activism that ultimately exists. I think that a well-known example of this could be like the Bernie Bros in the United States, who often did a lot of canvassing, and then these groups are often important in doing things like increasing voter turnout that exists. A large part of the campaigning process is recognizing who we ought to target with the limited resources that we have in order to win the election. So kind of similar to how in debates we think what could be a path to victory for our side or our team, campaigns also try and be strategic. Given that they have limited resources and limited time, they need to decide who is the most likely people who they can swing, who are the most likely people who they're able to mobilize, and stuff like that. So I think something important is that campaigns often aren't just only trying to persuade new voters and persuade swing voters, but often mobilize your own base. And a lot of political scientists argue that it's a more effective campaigning strategy to engage in voter mobilization rather than to trying to win people from the other side, given that it's less mental work. So in order to convince someone to come and vote who already agrees ideologically with your political party, it's just about making them a bit more passionate. Perhaps like a phone call or a door knock before the election could push them to vote. Whereas especially in polarized party systems where there's fewer centrists, and even if people more like tacitly agree with a certain party, it's a lot more difficult to persuade them to shift political beliefs that they've often held for a fairly long period of time. So campaigning is often extremely mobilization based. In terms of what the most effective campaign strategies are, there isn't complete consensus on this, but a lot of people find that like conventional campaigning is the most effective, some more historical kinds of campaigning. So some studies show that knocking on doors improves turnout by 10%, phone calls 4%, and like you've probably seen lawn signs, those are less effective, where it's estimated that they only help about 2%. The campaigning process is something that is changing over time. So especially with the rise of the internet and shifting technology, it's become a lot more decentralized and grassroots. A lot more candidates use things like social media during their campaigning process, which helps with outreach, but also makes politics a lot more personalistic. And there have also been things like an increase of crowdfunding donations rather than just larger institutional donations that are helping smaller candidates as well. Next slide. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about regarding campaigning are some problems with campaigning. So the first major problem are asymmetries of who gets covered within a campaign. And this exists both in terms of like buying media, but also in terms of unearned media, which will be an important concept that I'll talk about. So one way that a candidate or a party gets media attention is in buying ads and purchasing media, which is often quite expensive given that it's competitive not only with other political candidates, but also just like other corporations and people within society who also want to buy ads. Very intuitively, this is likely to favor both the wealthiest parties and the largest parties who have like just the largest budgets and who are the most institutionalized, who are able to buy those ads and therefore have asymmetric power to forward their message and to try and appeal to new voters. Something that's quite important though is also the concept of unearned media within campaigning. So this is not media that is directly purchased and controlled by a specific party, but rather just other actors who take it upon themselves in order to report on a certain candidate and to report on their message. Now, something interesting with an unearned media is both considering how it reinforces cycles of privilege, but also in the kind of candidates who get covered by unearned media. So I think that unearned media definitely favors largest parties most in a similar way to earned media who have like the most visibility, because even if you're not buying it, they just tend to be the most well-known and therefore make for more interesting stories and parties people haven't heard about on the basis of relatability. But I also think that unearned media tends to favor the most scandalous candidates as well. So a huge factor in the Trump-Clinton race was that Trump earned substantially more unearned media attention than Clinton did, just based on all of like the crazy comments that he was making that people on both sides of the political spectrum found interesting and engaging for different reasons. So you would have to then make arguments why more populist and personalized politics are bad in order to prove like unearned media can be something that's problematic, but it's definitely interesting to consider what kind of candidates it reports on, which favors most like controversial, provocative candidates in terms of the kind of things that they're ultimately saying. A second problem within campaigning that can also kind of fall under asymmetries if it gets covered, which has also been briefly alluded to in the workshop, is just differential attentions to different regions. So I think that the concepts of swing states is the most important here. This applies the most in first past the post systems. So these are systems where there's regionally divided districts and then you win a seat from that district. In this case, given that each district often tends to go like quite consistently in certain political directions, if they are a safe seat for a political party, they often get neglected because it's an inefficient use of resources to try and persuade people to vote differently in that district, but it's already locked in for a specific party, meaning that the most rational strategy for parties just becomes concentrating their resources on a few geographic regions who are not really locked in either side of the political spectrum, which both leads to unfairness in terms of like political information mechanisms, but more importantly, you often end up making things like the most promises to these regions within campaigning itself that can lead to more resources after the election being devoted toward these specific regions, even if it would not be the most efficient use of how resources could ultimately be deployed. I think that something else to consider here is that even without like swing states, and this can apply more in other kinds of systems, is that you often want to make more promises and do more campaigning in large urban areas. The reason being that improving social services within these areas will naturally impact a larger number of people than improving services in less populated areas, meaning that that can also become a more rational political strategy, even if on like a utilitarian basis, on the basis of urgency, it would be better to invest in like rural regions. The third problem with campaigning is the idea of negative campaigning. So negative campaigning is a process of deliberately spreading negative information about a certain candidate to worsen the public image of them, which most often takes the form of what can often be quite brutal attack ads. These attack ads often play into identity-based characteristics of candidates that are quite controversial, whether it be someone's age or race or their gender. To give an example of a really famous attack ad was the campaign of Lyndon B. Johnson in the state, who successfully portrayed Republican Barry Goldwater as threatening nuclear war. So it often takes like one campaign component of a particular candidate and then blows it up to try and frame their entire identity within that particular way. I think that there's quite intuitive harms that flow from the negative campaigning process of just it erodes trust in the political establishment more broadly when you're constantly bombarded with messaging, not about why your candidate is good per se, but why other candidates are incompetent and crazy. And it also contributes to promoting forms of polarization as well, when you often frame other candidates as being very, very extreme in what their policies are, even when in actuality their campaign pledges are different and can be more moderate. A potential solution to the negative campaigning process that is sometimes proposed are having ranked ballots. So this is a voting system where you would rank your preference of candidates on a list. And then there'd basically be a system where like if there's not a majority after like the first thing, they would go to like the second thing. There's different proposals for how the ranked ballot system would work. This is a theoretical means to decrease incentives for negative campaigning, because if you campaign really negatively about another candidate who like other people have an affinity to within the political spectrum, that could also make them look to you as a politician less favorably, and then they might rank you lower on your list. So it can kind of be an accountability incentive in terms of promoting less negative campaigning to avoid alienation where people would otherwise rank you lower. Moving on to the next section. So the next thing that I'm going to be talking about are political parties, and in particular, how to just make good arguments in favor and against political parties. So I'm going to start out by discussing some of the problems of political parties, some of which have been briefly alluded to, some of which have not. So in terms of certain problems with political parties, the first one is that they're insufficient in capturing the diversity of preferences that ultimately exist. The way that you make this argument is that there's often only a couple parties, as Hadar mentioned, that cannot represent the diversity of views that ultimately exist. And therefore, there are certain people who might be like fiscally conservative but socially liberal. But if there's only two parties and they're both liberal in both directions, you don't really have a sufficient means to turn to. This is probably more of a problem in first past the post systems and proportional representation systems. So the average European political system has more political parties than the average political system in a first past the post country. However, even if you have like 5 parties, these are still often insufficient in capturing the nuances of what people's political belief systems actually are. The next thing is that parties are poor at adapting and reflecting preferences. And I think that this is quite important. So they're often older elites within party structures who wield a high degree of influence and know that these people have often been ideologically indoctrinated by a party for a long period of time and therefore are very set in what their beliefs are. So even if you have primaries, which was suggested earlier in the seminar as a way to like improve direct reach with voters and have their say be magnified, you can still often have these kind of elite-based figures who are pulling strings in terms of which candidates are on the primary list in the first place, but also you can have party elites do things like with like their media apparatuses favor a particular candidate more or fund a particular candidate more. I'm going to give an example of this of the recent general election in Japan that's quite important. So there was a general election that was held at the end of October this year, which followed a tumultuous period in Japanese politics after Shinzo Abe resigned, and then there was a new person who was really unpopular. So the person who was put into power was Kishida. However, he was not popular amongst the people. He was just popular amongst the party's elites. So the candidate who was favored by the people was Kono Taro. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing their names. However, the reason why Mr. Kishida was elected by the party rather than Kono Taro is that he was the figure who was favored by the party elites, not even because he agreed with his ideology the most, but just because the LDP, who is the dominant party in Japan, is a very factionalized party, and therefore he was the most pliable and least threatening figure to the most elite factions, and therefore the party decided to favor him rather than to favor the candidate who was actually popular within the people. So there's often that disconnect of like the elites within the party wield too much power over how decision-making ultimately happens. And based on things like hereditary voting that Lucie also mentioned, this also means that parties can often become complacent in terms of not really ideologically innovating what their belief systems are, because they just think that people who voted for them for years are going to vote for them anyways. The third thing is that parties raise the barriers to entry to newer forms of political participation. So it's very difficult for people to run as independent given the bulk of the party system that I discussed earlier in terms of the massive campaigning apparatuses that ultimately exist. It's really hard to compete with like mass budgets that parties have. What this means is that it makes it harder for smaller parties to break into systems. Of course, there's examples of them emerging with like green parties that have risen in some states, but in the vast majority of cases, we've had the same parties who have ultimately been existing for decades as well. And it also means that like there's also disparities of privilege when you're competing with a huge wealth of parties. It's particularly problematic for those who are less well off, maybe a bit less than now with like more crowdfunding to be able to break into the political scene. The fact that barriers to entry for new people to enter the political scene are high also makes party whipping systems extremely effective because you don't really have too many other alternatives to turn to as a candidate if you're not fielded by the party again. So parties have a lot of leverage over individual MPs because unless you consistently do things like toe the party line, it's possible that they're not going to allow you to run again, or in like a PR system will put you lower down on the party list. The reason why this can be problematic is that if you are elected by like a region or something, your allegiance might be more to the party line, even at the expense of the constituents who you've ultimately been elected to represent. Now moving toward the benefits of parties. So one thing that you can say is that the comparative would be less representation. And I think that this is kind of a key argument to break the problem a bit in this debate. So even if you have two parties, the incentive of the average party is to cater toward the lowest common denominator, which is often viewed as a term in like a negative light and like the lowest common denominator is shallow. But I think you can actually argue that it's advantageous because what it means is that the majority of people are going to have some facet of their political identity represented because the party is basically just catering toward like the average person's political identity. Whereas if you had a more fragmented party system, even if like 10% of people are perfectly represented by this new party, if they are more like niche than other parties, it's less likely to cater towards some facet of someone's political identity. The next thing is just why voter decisions are likely to be more harmful in a world in the absence of parties. So parties are useful information mechanisms. They serve as heuristic devices and bundle policy dimensions for voters who lack the time and inclination to learn about every issue. So while campaigning messages, as we discussed, are often simplified, which can be viewed as being a bad thing, I think you can argue that this is probably a good thing. In order for someone to make an informed vote, you don't need to know every single policy of a party, but rather you just need to know what their broad ideology is. Do you support things like lower or higher taxation? Do you support things like more socially liberal policies? And when you know their core messages, you're able to determine which party is more within your own best interest, especially when these parties are like consistently existing throughout a period of time. What happens though when you have a political scene that's more dominated by individuals? It's very difficult to learn about individual policy platforms every single election and to take the time to actually do that in detail. When you're unable to learn that about the detailed pledges of all of these people, you're more likely to resort to other metrics of how you are voting. Which candidate do I want to have a beer with? Whose personality do I ultimately think is like the coolest, rather than actual things like what represents your political identity and governing experience, which you can argue then would lead to like worse policies. The third thing is just a classic argument against coalition governments in general. But if you don't have a couple of robust parties, you're going to get a more fragmented government. We're going to have like a bunch of individuals or very small parties who are all governing together. That's going to create more disagreement in government and make it harder for policies to be passed. The next thing that you can say is that parties actually equalize the barriers to entry a lot more. So in a world where you just have more independents running, this is going to lead to just who is the richest dominating the political scene the most. So like millionaires and billionaires are always going to have a leg up within politics. Even if poor people cannot compete against political parties, the mechanism for entry under the status quo is these people can often get like hired by a party, join a party, and then work up the party ladder. So there's a mechanism for diversity and allowing more people to opt into politics in that regard. You can argue that there's more lobbying when there's individuals because people are just more financially desperate, which might be a bit uncomparative. There's a lot of lobbying status quo, which we'll talk about in a second. And finally, you can also argue that parties are actually an important form of accountability. So if you only have individuals, there's sometimes imperfect accountability because you might not be able to track what they're doing in detail, but also they might not run again. Whereas on the other hand, parties don't want to have a poor reputation in the long term, meaning that a candidate going rogue and deviating too much from the party line would reflect badly on the party. And therefore they have an incentive to do things like monitor candidates and promote internal accountability, even if that accountability would not exist externally. But given that like these people are often making like campaign promises and people often vote for parties, not candidates, you can flip the party whipping as bad to actually argue that it's good to have more internal accountabilities within parties to guarantee that MPs are towing the party line. Moving on to the final slide. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly go into more detail about the role of lobbying using some concepts. So the first is the iron triangle in the US, which will combine what Jacklin was talking about bureaucracies and policymaking, and then what was being spoken about by Hadar in terms of interest groups and stuff. So this is a model that was designed to understand lobbying in the US, but I do think it's applicable across a broader number of countries. The thesis of the iron triangle is that policy-making processes often result from the collusion of the three facets of the triangle and like subgroups of governments that end up catering toward the interests of these people in particular, rather than the interests of people on the ground. So there's two concepts that are typically spoken about: consumers and constituencies. So consumers are just people who could serve to benefit from like policies and who are going to be on the receiving ends of policies, whereas constituencies are the interest groups who are represented in kind of like the bottom, like this tier of the triangle. So how the triangle ultimately works is that Congress relies on interest groups to get elected. Therefore, Congress will often favor certain powerful constituencies and interest groups within the kind of pledges that they're making. However, the triangle also draws in the bureaucracy as well, because in the same way that the Congress relies on interest groups, the bureaucracy also relies on Congress for things like direct funding for the policies that they're going to be implementing, and also for forms of political support as well, because the bureaucracy is often supported by Congress, meaning that the bureaucracy has to also implicitly cater toward the very same interest groups that Congress does, because they are by extension also reliant on their support. And you also often have direct mechanisms where the interest groups will lobby members of the bureaucracy as well, which will then lead to like less regulations on those interest groups and special favors. So it just means to show the very dynamic process in which lobbying happens, which is why there's so much influence of special interest groups. And just like, I'm just going to briefly go into the segue of the last thing on the slide of just like the role of the money in distorting campaigns. So interest groups are very, very, very powerful. A core illustration of this, if you want an example in a debate, is the 2010 Citizens United court case in the States, which is like the seminal court case of discussing the power of corporations within politics, which allowed super PACs to be formed, which just allows huge amounts of money to be raised within the political scene. The final main concept that I want to talk about is the revolving door concept, which discusses a relationship between the government and the private sector. So just like this concept just means that officials who worked for government and in bureaucracies often later on continue their careers in the private sector. And the reason why they do this is because they might just like retire early, they're voted out of office, they might just get bored and want a new job. The private sector is often higher paying. So you often have people who are literally regulating agencies who go on to work for the same businesses who they are regulating. The clear issue here is that you're putting people who have intimate knowledge of regulations and by extension, how to bypass those regulations in the company. They know which accounting tricks are more rarely detected by the regulators. Like they know which areas of industry are the most underregulated and therefore they can get away with the most things. And because of the negative cycle, almost like cross-contamination in a sense, that really harms accountability structures. The final note that I'll make before ending this off is also the role of implicit lobbying. So even if companies do not like explicitly give money to a party, they often still have influence. One way that this ends up happening is because you don't want to alienate these political actors who would then fund other sides of the political spectrum. But another thing is that a key way to get elected is often wealth generation and helping the economy. It's often difficult for politicians to do this extremely directly, but they know that if they screw over the wealth generators of the economy, being the corporations, are going to be in trouble, which then ends up giving the wealth generators corporations some degree of influence as well. So this is the end of my section about lobbying, which also marks the end of our seminar. We're going to have to do the sparse soon, but what we can have now is a brief 5-minute Q&A period. If you have questions about any of our sections, you can feel free to pop the questions in the chat, to raise your hand, and someone who's relating to that section will answer you.
Okay, so I think there's 2 questions now. I think one is for Naomi and one is for Hadar. But Shaura, if you just want to write the question.
Oh, sorry, I just saw the question about my section about the iron triangle. What I'm going to do is, given I don't have a ton of time, it's a bit complex. I watched a video on this a few days ago. I'm going to link it in the chat, although I can try go over it briefly. Okay, so the concept of it is that different components of the political system collude, which creates a negative form of lobbying, because while they're supposed to be checks and balances of one another, they all end up catering toward the key constituency groups, being the interest groups, rather than implementing policies that are going to help consumers on the ground. Congress cares about interest groups because the interest groups help Congress get reelected. The bureaucracy is dependent on Congress because Congress provides them with funding and political support, which means that the bureaucracy does not want to alienate the Congress, so they're not going to help the consumers, but rather they're also going to, by extension, cater toward constituents more. The triangle also directly involves interest groups influencing the bureaucracy as well via forms of direct lobbying, which bypasses Congress, which means that the end policies that the bureaucracy implements are often more catered toward interest groups, which are not the average person, rather are just like powerful lobbyist figures.
Okay, to answer the question just in chat, is it legitimate to make claims that are centered on functional democracies that aren't in developed countries? Some judges seem to discredit claims that are made for those countries despite the standard. I'm not here to speak for all judges, but generally, I don't think it's central to the core of the workshop, but as of recent, both the WUDC briefing as well as the EUDC briefing say that motions apply not exclusively to liberal or Western democracies. So generally, yeah, it is legit to speak about non-liberal democracies.
Sorry.
If technocracies can be justified by showing that democracies can lead to bad outcomes, how do we generally prove technocracies have actually good interests at heart? I may have missed the detail on this. Okay, so this is the part that I kind of brushed over in the sense that I want to believe in the competency of most CAs that are nominated for a reason, that you will not be needed to defend in motions like the absolute majority of dictatorships or the worst of them. I think it's kind of hard to defend within debate context North Korea. What often comes up in debating is either debates that are more world-grounded, such as this house prefers a wealthy technocracies or autocracies to poor democracies, or stuff that are more philosophical, such as this house would prefer a philosopher king over a modern liberal democracy. In both of these cases, while you don't get to just assert that they'll make good policy decisions, you usually do get enough grounding to claim that they are likely to be good and lead to better policies. The second thing is, while it might be hard to defend technocracies, it is usually quite easy to bash on democracy and explain why it leads to a lot of bad outcomes quite inherently due to, I don't know, general populism that is enabled through democracy, or the fact that within democracy, we get a lot less protection of minority, and it's much easier for majoritarian rule to not actually represent anyone, or just the classic people are dumb thing. State power principle. You mentioned how local authorities allow for more opt-out. What does this opt-out look like? So this means that the opt-out, as in opting out of a legal system, is easier the more the system is localized. It is much easier for you to move from one city to another within your country than it is to immigrate from your country to another country. Yeah, I think that's the biggest, all the questions I saw.
Yeah, and maybe just adding to Hadar's answer based on the assumption that democracies are capable of passing laws. So if I could just add something, it also depends how central that assumption is to key clashes in a debate. So if the motion is about whether or not you are able to successfully pass a specific policy, like for example, enacting criminal justice reform, you can't just assume that these democracies will pass these laws because they're capable of passing these laws. Often what you need is lots of other analysis about, for example, whether or not interest groups would be successful at pressuring policymakers to pass laws, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's a periphery assumption that's not key to winning the actual debate, so for example, if you're talking about, I don't know, like electoral mechanisms and not policy specifically, then I think the assumption that democracies are capable of passing laws is just fine to make without much more supplementary analysis.
Yep.
I think
So I see a question for, oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, just one sec. So if we can, I would want to show the draw really briefly because there's some people who seem to be missing, and then give them a bit to message that they are here, and Matt can answer the question in as that's happening, if that's okay. So that we save on time. I just wanna, wait, I think I should have the permission to share screen. Or, okay, my Wi-Fi is garbage. I just shared it in the group chat if one of you would be able to share the tab.
Yeah, okay, cool. In the meantime, while that's being sorted out, I'll ask the question in the chat. The question is, I have a question about Matt's IR resources section. Do you have some advice on staying up to date better on things that don't involve the English sphere? I feel like even with consuming a solid amount of English post-Swiss media, I'm sometimes blindsided by issues about at least some US, UK, EU involvement. And then Sharia has a follow-up, which is adding to Dino. Other than CFR and Al Jazeera, how do I learn about AU, African Union, I'm assuming stuff specifically. Okay, cool. So there are a couple things that I tend to do. This is non-exhaustive, obviously, as we're operating on limited time, but there are a couple of ways I try to diversify my news intake such that it relies on things other than the Anglosphere and news media within it. One thing I would do when I was seriously prepping for majors, and will likely do again very soon, is I would try to subscribe to a news organization from each part of the world. So I would try to subscribe to news organizations from each broad geographic region, but also sort of each individual general regions. So Southeast, one news source from South Asia, for example, one news source from Southeast Asia, one news source that focuses on the Middle East and North Africa, one news source that focuses on EU politics. And then I would subscribe to each of them on Facebook. And then those articles would pop up in my feed daily. And I would make it an effort to read at least one or two of them per day. So in terms of staying consistent and up to date on these news things, I think it tends to, the strategy I would use would be to make it such that it's easy to integrate into your day-to-day life. And it shows up regularly and consistently on platforms you would frequent otherwise. So for example, following Japan Today on Facebook, for instance, or following Al Jazeera English on Facebook, for instance, is a quite useful way at keeping up on various regional elements in the world as they accrue over time. You just have to make an effort to subscribe to them. In terms of African Union resources specifically, I myself should probably do far more reading on IR than I currently do. What I do for like general regions of the world stuff is I tend to follow either Real Clear World, which tends to aggregate news from all over the world, including the African Union, or follow specific news sources on Facebook. So this would be like specific newspapers. I imagine that others may be more well-versed than me in that specific question and might have specific news sources that are high quality and good for you to point to. But generally, my focus is on sort of breadth and consistency of exposure of information as opposed to depth on any one specific one. Naomi just put one in the chat, which I think is great. Hope that sort of answers the question.